and Minister for Economy, Civil Service and Communications, the Honourable Ayaz Syed Qayyum, to move his motion. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, Mr. Speaker, I move that the Parliament that Fiji, sorry, Mr. Speaker, sir, I move that Parliament approve that Fiji ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Is there a seconder?
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to second the motion.
I now invite the Honourable Attorney General to speak to his motion. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, Mr. Speaker, sir, I won't be too long on this particular treaty. As we know that, Mr. Speaker, sir, the committee has recommended that Parliament actually approve the ratification of the treaty without reservations, and we are, of course, in concurrence with this recommendation, Mr. Speaker, sir. Just very briefly, the treaty sets out a comprehensive set of prohibitions against participating in any nuclear weapon activities. These include undertakings by member states to the treaty to not develop, test, produce, acquire, process, stockpile, use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. The treaty also prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons on national territory and the provision of assistance to any state in the conduct of prohibited activities. It puts an obligation on us, Mr. Speaker, sir, to not have those nuclear weapons on our soil, even though those may not actually belong to us. Mr. Speaker, sir, the state parties are obliged to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited under the treaty undertaken by persons or treaties under its jurisdiction and control. The treaty also obliges state parties to provide adequate assistance to individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, as well as to take necessary and appropriate measures of environmental jurisdiction or control which are contaminated as a result of activities related to the testing or use of nuclear weapons. We know, Mr. Speaker, sir, that many of the colonial powers pre-World War II and post-World War II used a number of their Pacific territories to do a lot of nuclear testing, and indeed hydrogen bombs were also tested in the northern Pacific too, Mr. Speaker, sir. I'd like to, Mr. Speaker, sir, just highlight by way of background, there are already 81 signatories to the treaty, including Fiji. We signed the treaty at the March of the 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly, 20 September 2017. The treaty is currently not in force. It will enter into force 90 days after the 50th instrument of ratification, acceptance, approval, or accession has been deposited. There are currently only 37 states, Mr. Speaker, sir, that are actual parties to the treaty. The treaty complements the existing nuclear disarmament instruments, namely the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, that establishes general prohibitions. Mr. Speaker, sir, I won't necessarily go into details, but just to also highlight, Mr. Speaker, sir, there's one particular provision that obliges states to provide remedy to those that have actually been affected by nuclear testing, etc. And Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji, of course, has had a history of that, where our people were actually exposed to that. And there has been for decades a number of our soldiers who were actually taken to this testing site have been clamoring for some form of compensation, both through the British government and, of course, through subsequent post-independent governments. And Mr. Speaker, sir, Fijian soldiers participated in the 9 UK nuclear weapon tests at Malden and Kiritimati, or Christmas Islands, now part of the Republic of Kiribati. Test veterans, including Fijians and civilian survivors, claimed their health, as well as the descendants were adversely affected by exposure to ionizing radiation. Though the UK government assured coverage of Fijian troops' service-related health problems, during the test it has offered them no assistance or compensation. Instead, Mr. Speaker, sir, this government, under the leadership of a Prime Minister, stepped in to offer a one-off grant to veterans to support medical and welfare costs in 2015. The 24 survivors who attended the ceremony each received Fijian US $4,788 or $9,855 Fijian from a compensation pool of $2.95 million. As you know, Mr. Speaker, sir, you yourself would know this, that this was a very lingering sore and this was actually put to rest, despite all those decades of recognition, firstly, of what our people went through, and secondly, for them to receive some form of compensation. Mr. Speaker, sir, Article 7 requires all state parties to cooperate to facilitate the implementation of the treaty, including seeking and receiving assistance from other parties to fulfill treaty obligations, and if the state party is in a position to do so, providing technical and financial assistance to state parties. Mr. Speaker, sir, the requirements for implementation, I'll just very quickly go into that, and I'm sure the Minister for Defence will also have some comments in respect of this particular treaty. Obligations for state parties, expressly articulated in Article 1 of the treaty. As such, the treaty is a broad prohibition provision that specifically obligates each state party to never, under any circumstances, assist, encourage, induce in any way, or anyone to engage in activity prohibited to a state party in the treaty. Mr. Speaker, sir, the impact of the convention. Fiji is continuing to support regional disarmament platforms such as the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty of Rarotonga, which bans the manufacture, acquisition, possession or control of nuclear devices within the Pacific. Mr. Speaker, sir, it also is an extension of Fiji's acceptance of the regional and international nuclear disarmament instruments that seek to rid this planet of any nuclear threats. This includes the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which Fiji acceded to in 1972, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which Fiji ratified in 1996, Mr. Speaker, sir. Fiji, Mr. Speaker, sir, clearly supports the initiative to ban nuclear weapons and to reduce the risk of its accidental, mistaken, unauthorized or intentional use on this planet, given its catastrophic and humanitarian consequences, as we've seen, whether it's Chernobyl, whether it's in Japan, Mr. Speaker, sir. It should be noted that Fiji's position is the result of our first-hand experience of the destruction and long-lasting effects that nuclear weapons have had on Fijians, who remain without victim assistance and reparation from the state that actually carried out the testing itself. Ratifying the treaty, Mr. Speaker, sir, would promote cooperation, strengthen international relations with other state parties, Mr. Speaker, sir, but also signal to the world that Fiji is very much concerned about ensuring that we have a peaceful global climate. This global community on ensuring sustainable livelihoods, on ensuring that we arrest the problems associated and the effects of climate change. And not to squander the Parliament approved the ratification of the treaty without reservations. Thank you.
Thank the Honourable Attorney General. The floor is now open for debate on this motion. Honourable Minister for Defence, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.